Chapter 3 The Bogeyman for Adults. Roger ran down the corridor and burst through the doors into the office. The 24 employees, hearing the clatter, looked up from their desks and saw his panicked expression. "Quick," he yelled. "We need to get out. The building's on fire." Pulses raced. Everyone jumped to their feet and made a beeline for the emergency exit. Once on the street, they gazed back into the building, looking for the first signs of smoke and flames. They waited and waited. Nothing happened. Eventually, Roger walked towards the building, pushed open the door, and looked back over his shoulder with a mischievous grin. Suckers! Roger had manufactured a believable threat and made the others invest in that belief. Once implanted, the belief manipulated their emotions, fear, which then controlled their behavior. Running. Of course, the scam was over after they had been standing outdoors for a few minutes, but for the duration of the experiment, Roger got his colleagues to do what he wanted them to do. He essentially mind-controlled them. It's especially important to note that they would have felt completely in charge of their own actions during the whole episode. This is the genius of mind control, to influence a person's behavior while the intended target unwittingly believes he's completely in control. Now, imagine Roger had changed one variable in his experiment. Let's say the words he used were, "Quick, we need to get out. There's a werewolf down the corridor and boy is he pissed." It wouldn't have had quite the same effect, would it? For a threat to be effective, it must be believable. Not true, not provable, just believable. One of my chief objections to Christianity is its use of the threat of damnation. The fear of hell is a believable threat to a society already steeped in a religious ideology. A warning must have credibility to work effectively, and that's where the zeitgeist comes in. Everybody knows this, so it must be true. It's all well and good to warn someone of a real threat, but how often is the threat of God's judgment presented without any evidence to back it up? Instead, it relies on the zeitgeist. It depends on people being exposed to Christianity en masse, conditioned from birth to think, it must be true because I've heard it so often and everybody else around here believes it. Imagine no one had ever heard of Christianity, and an archaeologist today suddenly unearthed the Gospels and told the world, "I've just learned that there's a God who holds us all in condemnation, but if we do what these scrolls say, we'll be saved." How much of an impact do you think that would have? Sometimes the words are dressed up in a positive fashion, how God, in his love, sent his Son to die as a sacrifice to save us from his judgment. But the underlying message is always the same. Unless you do what we tell you, you will be damned to hell for all eternity. The word gospel means good news, but it relies on us first knowing about the bad news of God's judgment. The whole message boils down to love at gunpoint. Accept the free gift of my love or face the consequences. The bottom line is this. Without evidence, the gospel doesn't mean anything. And the onus is really on the salesman to present you with the evidence. It's not the responsibility of those on the receiving end to go looking. I mean, do we really have to investigate the claims of every religion on the planet, just in case one of them might be true, and we may miss our tiny window of opportunity to obtain salvation? Christianity presents a message that everybody needs to hear in order to be saved from some terrible fate, but only a portion of the world ever gets to hear it. It's a game of eternity by postcode. If you're not lucky enough to be born in a locale where the one true religion gets a hearing, then it would have been better for you if you were never born. Furthermore, according to Christianity, we're born with original sin, a fallen nature that ensures we cannot get through life without committing sins. Despite never having a choice about whether we wish to be born, we discover that we have no choice but to become sinners, no choice about falling under God's judgment, no choice about being born in a country where we never hear the message of salvation, and no choice about suffering in hell for all eternity. Is it possible that this rigged game is a true and credible picture of what lies behind human existence? When these problems started to finally become clear to me, after almost 20 years of experience as a Christian, I started to see what the whole game of religion was about: mind control. Christianity uses an unsubstantiated threat to control your thinking and thus dictate your behavior. There's no other way to describe what I did when I became a Christian. I no longer had any freedom to think for myself. I could never say, "Original sin? I'm not sure about that. Maybe there's another reason for all the trouble in the world." The Word of God declared it to be the truth, and so I had to believe it. Original sin and an assortment of other truths then shaped my character and actions. Having the freedom to think your own thoughts means being able to make your own judgment calls on what is possible and impossible, true and untrue, right and wrong, to formulate a worldview that you have worked out with your own mind. Christianity takes that freedom away and says, no need to think for yourself. In fact, it's perilous to do so, but never mind, we've worked it all out for you. Pre-packaged, ready-made truth. I recognize that not all Christians come to believe by being made afraid of judgment, and to them what I'm saying may sound offensive. You don't live in fear. I know you don't, because I didn't live in fear for most of my Christian life either. I felt safe and secure under God's protection. But just wait till you experience doubt. It's not a comfortable spot to be in when your mind starts seeing a different picture and you sense your faith ebbing away. When doubt grows to the extent that you think Christianity is probably false and you make the leap into disbelief, it's not pleasant to consider what might happen to your soul if you've unwittingly made a bad decision. A voice in your head cries in panic, "What if I'm wrong?" And another soothing voice says, "Look, it's much more comfortable over here. Don't think, just believe, and you won't have to feel afraid anymore." The fear of God's judgment is Christianity's big magnet, designed to pull you in and hold you in. God becomes the adult version of the Bogeyman, a repackaging of the myth that cruel parents use to keep their children from sneaking out of bed during the night. "I don't know that there's a monster in my closet," muses the child, "but Daddy says there is, and I don't think he would lie, so I had better do as I'm told." Similarly, the adult says to himself, "I don't know that there's a hell, but the church and the Bible say there is, and I don't think they would lie, so I had better do as I'm told." French philosopher Blaise Pascal, 1623 to 1662, crystallized this predicament in what is called Pascal's wager. When the existence of God can neither be proved nor disproved, there is much to be gained from wagering that God exists, everlasting life, and little to be gained from wagering that he does not, annihilation at death. Conversely, one has nothing to lose in believing, the worst case scenario for the believer is annihilation, but everything to lose in disbelieving, where the worst case scenario is eternal punishment. Belief in God is therefore the best bet. The first problem with Pascal's wager is that it is entirely motivated by the desire for security, not truth. It is the way of the coward who runs for cover at the first sign of danger. This mental attitude is utterly toxic to the pursuit of truth, because one's course is guided not by logic, but by emotional pressures. The reason why our beliefs are so easily shaped by our emotions can be understood by looking at prehistory. Back when we were hunter-gatherers living in the wild, the scientific method of disbelieving in something until you have sufficient evidence wouldn't have served us very well. If a man heard a bush rustling a few feet away, he had a greater survival advantage if he assumed that there was a predatory animal just out of sight beyond the leaves. That belief would cause him to act accordingly and retreat from the danger, real or imagined. There would have been a distinct survival disadvantage in taking the stance, "I will not believe there is a predator behind the bush until I part the leaves and see for myself." Evolution gave us brains that are wired for survival, not objectivity. Pursuing truth objectively requires us to overcome emotional pressures that attempt to shape our beliefs. The next problem is that the wager fails to ask, which God? The God of the Christians or the God of the Muslims? It could be argued that both are the same God, but Christianity and Islam each claim exclusive status as the one true route to God. Both warn of hell and damnation for rejecting the offer of salvation. Both cannot be true. The security that Pascal's wager proposes is an illusion. How one reacts to it depends entirely on which religion is the most familiar to the individual. Thirdly, if one chooses to believe only because he is afraid to disbelieve, is that even genuine belief? Would an all-seeing God not see the base motive behind the outer appearance of religious conviction? Fourthly, if Christians are having a personal relationship with God, as they often claim, how can they simultaneously speak of his existence as nothing more than the safest bet? If they know him, then no wager is needed because he is real in personal experience. If they want to use the wager, they have to be willing to admit that they don't know God personally. They can't have it both ways. Lastly, it is simply not true to say that there is little to be gained from wagering that God does not exist. One's whole outlook on life is determined by his philosophical and religious perspective. Make the wrong choice and you face an earthly existence, which could be your only one, that will be poisoned by falsehood. I refused the easy route. I thought to myself, if the threat of damnation were taken away and I had a simple choice right now of what to believe, would I continue to believe in Christianity? The answer was no. If the only reason I had left to believe was because I was being coerced into it, then that was no good reason at all. The judgment of God is very hard to truly believe in, even for a Christian. It's one thing to tell yourself that you believe in the reality of hell, but quite another to actually believe it. Looking back on my own Christian experience, I can see this self-deception in action. In 2005, my mother was dying of cancer and she was not a Christian. As she lay in hospital, I wrestled with myself. If you don't say something to her now, before it's too late, you'll never forgive yourself. So a couple of days before the end, when she was drifting in and out of consciousness on morphine, I spoke to her briefly about my concern for her soul, asking her to get right with God. She mumbled, "I will, son," and fell right back into a drug-induced slumber. Was this genuine religious conviction, or merely comforting words from a loving mother who could not bear to see her son in distress? I never knew. And for some reason it never became a worry for me. I remained a Christian for several years after her death, and in all that time I never had an anxious thought about the possibility that she was suffering in hell for all eternity. Such a scenario was simply unreal, even as a remote possibility. My emotions were telling me that I didn't believe in the judgment of God, while my mind was telling me I did. If what you think and what you feel are in conflict, it may be a signal that you're lying to yourself. The next time you hear a Christian talking about hell and judgment, pay careful attention to his emotions, not just his words. You might glimpse a very revealing contradiction. There are those who warn me about hell as if they're talking about the weather. On the opposite extreme are those who seem to take a sadistic delight in vividly describing the bodily tortures I will suffer in the lake of fire. If such persons truly believe in the judgment of God, they must be entirely without compassion for the plight of human beings. I suspect, rather, that they have as much compassion as anyone else, but are putting on a big act, to me and to themselves. Perhaps that's just as well, for how could anyone truly believe that such a horrific fate awaits the majority of the human race without it driving him insane?